Alright, let's start. Number 10. Jack Churchill. In December 1941, a British commando officer led his men ashore during a raid on Nazi-occupied Norway, carrying a longbow, a quiver of arrows, a Scottish broadsword, and a set of bagpipes. He was not confused about what century he was fighting in. Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, known to his men as Mad Jack, had made a deliberate calculation that audacity, raw and theatrical and utterly fearless, was its own form of weapon. He was about to prove himself right. Churchill had already demonstrated this philosophy in France in 1940, when he became the only soldier in the Second World War confirmed to have killed an enemy combatant with a longbow. He enlisted voluntarily, was assigned to No. 3 Commando, and approached warfare with the conviction that a man charging with a medieval blade inspired more terror than a man firing from cover. His commanding officers, to their credit, largely left him to it. The results were difficult to argue with. At the Vyagso raid on December 27, 1941, Churchill led the assault from the front, playing his bagpipes as the landing craft approached the Norwegian shore, then switching to his broadsword as the fighting began. 2 years later, during the Allied landings at Salerno, Italy in 1943, he single-handedly captured a German observation post and returned with 42 prisoners, having used nothing but his broadsword and the sheer defiant force of his presence. No other officer in the war produced a comparable result with comparable equipment. The Germans captured Churchill in Yugoslavia in 1944 after he was the sole survivor of an ambush, reportedly still playing his bagpipes as they closed in. He was sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, then to Dachau, and escaped from both. After the war, learning that the atomic bombs had ended the conflict in the Pacific, he reportedly expressed disappointment. Without the war, he said, the world would revert to being boring. He took up surfing. He was entirely serious about that too. Mad Jack Churchill proved something the military textbooks have never quite managed to codify: that in combat, the most irrational thing a man can do is sometimes the most effective. He did not survive the most ferocious war in human history, despite his defiant absurdity. He survived in no small part because of it. He died in 1996, aged 89, having never once questioned his methods. Number 9. Hiroo Onoda. On March 9, 1974, a Japanese soldier emerged from dense jungle on Lubang Island in the Philippines, stood at attention in a tattered but recognizable uniform, and formally surrendered his rifle, his sword, his dagger, and his ammunition to Philippine government officials. He was 52 years old. He was in good physical condition. He had not lost his mind. He had simply never received orders to stop fighting, so he had not stopped. The Second World War had ended 29 years earlier. Hiroo Onoda was a trained intelligence officer of the Imperial Japanese Army, deployed to Lubang Island in December 1944, with orders that his commanding officer stated with absolute clarity: he was to conduct guerrilla warfare, disrupt enemy operations, and never, under any circumstances, surrender. Onoda took those orders with the kind of indomitable seriousness that the Japanese military code demanded. When the war ended in August 1945, no one came to tell him. His orders had not changed, so neither did he. For nearly 3 decades, Onoda and a small band of companions moved through the Philippine jungle, ambushing patrols, avoiding capture, and dismissing every leaflet, every newspaper, and every loudspeaker broadcast declaring the war over as Allied propaganda. His comrades died one by one, killed in skirmishes with Philippine police and military forces who were simply trying to contain what they could not fully explain. By 1972, Onoda was alone. He continued the mission. A man who had not received orders to stop was, in his understanding, still a soldier at war. It took the Japanese government locating Onoda's former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, now a civilian bookseller, and flying him personally to Lubang Island in March 1974 to deliver the only thing that could end Onoda's war: a direct, face-to-face order to stand down. Onoda surrendered his rifle in full working order, along with 500 rounds of ammunition. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos pardoned him for the deaths and disruptions caused during his three-decade campaign. Onoda returned to Japan a man from another era, blinking into a world that had moved on without him. When does loyalty become its own kind of prison? And who bears responsibility for the soldiers a nation trains to never stop fighting? Onoda himself said he felt no regret. He had done his duty. That unyielding certainty, held for 29 years in a jungle by a man entirely alone, is either the most admirable thing a soldier ever did, or the most haunting, and the honest answer is probably both. Number 8. John Basilone. On the night of October 24th, 1942, approximately 3,000 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army's Sendai Division launched a massive, relentless assault on Henderson Field, the critical airstrip on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. Henderson Field was the strategic hinge of the entire Pacific campaign. Whoever held it controlled the air over the surrounding waters. The Japanese High Command had committed an entire division to taking it back. Between them and the runway stood a machine gun section of 15 United States Marines, commanded by Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone. Basilone had grown up in Raritan, New Jersey, the son of Italian immigrants, and enlisted in the Army at 17 before transferring to the Marine Corps. He was assigned to the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division, and deployed to Guadalcanal during the brutal island campaign of late 1942. He was not considered an exceptional figure before that night. He was a skilled machine gunner, steady under pressure, reliable. None of that prepared anyone for what the night of October 24th would require of him. The assault came in waves. 2 of Basilone's 3 machine gun sections were overrun and destroyed. He moved alone between positions, carrying ammunition through Japanese fire, repairing jammed weapons with his bare hands while the barrels burned hot enough to blister skin, and keeping his guns operational through hours of sustained combat. At one point, he physically carried a 90-pound machine gun across open ground under fire. When dawn came, the Sendai Division's assault had been broken. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers lay dead in front of Basilone's position. Henderson Field still stood. The United States Congress awarded Basilone the Medal of Honor in 1943, making him one of the first Marines so decorated in the Second World War. He became the most famous Marine in America, pulled from combat for a war bond tour that crossed the country. The Marine Corps offered him a commission as an officer. He declined both the promotion and the safe assignment, requesting return to active combat duty. His commanding officers granted the request. He shipped out to the Pacific again. John Basilone landed on the beaches of Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, in the first assault wave. He was killed by mortar fire within hours of hitting the beach. He had already saved the Pacific campaign once, and he went back because he believed the men on the next beach needed him. On February 19, 1945, he was right. The fact that being right killed him does not diminish what he chose. It defines it. Number 7. Lachhiman Gurung. In the hours before dawn on May 13, 1945, a single trench on the banks of the Irrawaddy River, near Tangdao, Burma, held one man against a force of approximately 200 Japanese soldiers advancing through the darkness. The man was Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung of the 8th Gurkha Rifles, 17th Indian Division. He was slightly built, by all accounts quiet and methodical in the way of men who have grown up in the mountains of Nepal. Before the night was finished, he would fight off that entire assault. He would do it with one hand, because the other one was gone. The 8th Gurkha Rifles had been fighting through the Burma campaign for years by the spring of 1945, pushing the Japanese army back through some of the most brutal terrain the war produced. Gurung was not a remarkable figure within the regiment. He was a rifleman, one of thousands, part of an army that had been fighting an unbroken, harrowing campaign across rivers and jungle and disease for the better part of 3 years. On the night of May 12th, the Japanese launched a desperate counterattack. Gurung's trench was directly in their path. The first grenade landed in his trench. Gurung threw it back before it detonated. The second grenade came in seconds later. He threw that one back too. The third grenade detonated in his right hand. It destroyed his hand entirely and tore apart most of his arm. His two comrades were wounded and unable to continue fighting. Gurung, bleeding massively, took his rifle in his remaining hand, braced it against the wall of the trench, and kept firing. He held that position for 4 hours, alone, through the remainder of the night. When his comrades and officers reached him at dawn, they found 31 Japanese soldiers dead in the ground, directly in front of his trench. The Victoria Cross citation, published in the London Gazette on September 27, 1945, records that Gurung, despite his grievous wound, dominated the situation and was responsible for the whole action. The citation, which is a primary military document, uses the word inspired to describe his effect on the men around him. Those men had heard him through the darkness, still firing, still holding. At what point does the human body become irrelevant to the human will? The 31 dead in front of Lachhiman Gurung's trench suggests the answer is further than any of us would like to believe. 200 soldiers advanced on one man in a trench by the Irrawaddy River, and the one man won. The mathematics of that night have never been satisfactorily explained by anything except the simple, devastating fact that Gurung had decided the position would hold. Number 6. Lyudmila Pavlichenko. In the summer of 1941, a 24-year-old history student walked into a Red Army recruitment office in Kiev and asked to enlist. Officers looked at her and suggested she become a nurse. She produced her marksmanship certificate from the Osoaviakim shooting club, where she had been training since her teens, and asked again for a rifle. They gave her one. Over the next 14 months, across the siege of Odessa and the siege of Sevastopol, Lyudmila Pavlichenko would record 309 confirmed kills, making her the most lethal female sniper in the history of warfare. Pavlichenko was born in 1916 in Bila Tserkva, Ukraine, and had been a competitive shooter from a young age. She was enrolled at Kiev University studying history when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. She volunteered immediately. The Red Army, which was by that point losing catastrophically and needed every trained person it could find, accepted her into the 25th Chapayev Rifle Division. She was given a Tokarev SVT-40 semi-automatic rifle and deployed to Odessa, where the Soviet position was besieged and desperate from the beginning. What distinguished Pavlichenko from a simply capable soldier was the specific nature of her kills. Of her 309 confirmed targets, 36 were enemy snipers, the most dangerous and difficult targets a sniper can pursue, because an enemy sniper is specifically trying to find and kill you first. Hunting another sniper requires patience, concealment, and a tolerance for stillness and silence that most soldiers cannot sustain. Pavlichenko was wounded 4 times over the course of her service and was finally evacuated from Sevastopol in June 1942 after her 4th wound made it impossible to continue. The German military took her presence seriously enough to address her directly over radio broadcasts, offering her land, money, and safe passage if she defected. Soviet records document multiple such broadcasts. She did not defect. In 1942, she was sent on a propaganda tour of North America, where she met President Franklin D. Roosevelt at the White House and became the first Soviet citizen to be received by an American president during the war. Eleanor Roosevelt befriended her personally. The German propaganda apparatus, which had been calling her Lady Death over their broadcasts, continued to do so. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was told she had no place on a battlefield. She proceeded to become the most lethal sniper the war produced on any side, and made the Third Reich address her by name. Her 309 confirmed kills are recorded in Soviet military archives and have never been seriously disputed. She fought a war on 2 fronts simultaneously, one against the Wehrmacht and one against the assumption that she should not have been there at all. She won both. Number 5. Matt Urban. Between June 14th and September 3rd, 1944, Captain Matt Urban of the 2nd Battalion, 60th Infantry Regiment, 9th Infantry Division was wounded 7 times in combat across the fields and towns of northern France and Belgium. 7 times he was evacuated. 7 times he returned to the front before his wounds had closed. On one occasion, he returned after being shot through the throat, unable to speak, issuing commands to his men by writing notes on scraps of paper. The United States Army would not formally acknowledge what he had done for another 35 years. Urban was born in 1919 in Buffalo, New York, and educated at Cornell University before receiving his commission. He was deployed to North Africa in 1942 and arrived in Normandy in June 1944 as part of the grinding, costly push inland from the beaches. The 9th Infantry Division fought through some of the most embattled terrain of the entire European campaign, village by village, hedgerow by hedgerow, against an enemy that had spent years fortifying every position. Urban's men, by the accounts collected during his eventual Medal of Honor review, consistently credited his presence as the reason they held when holding seemed impossible. The specific actions that form his citation are almost incomprehensible in aggregate. At Renouf, France, in June 1944, wounded and hospitalized, he learned his unit was pinned down and returned to the front against medical orders, personally destroying 2 German tank positions. At Stoumont, Belgium, in September 1944, he was shot through the throat, an injury that removed his ability to speak, and continued directing his battalion through handwritten notes while refusing evacuation. This was his 7th wounding. He had by that point been accumulating injuries for nearly 3 months without stopping. The Medal of Honor recommendation from his unit was prepared in 1944 and subsequently lost in the administrative chaos of the Normandy campaign. Urban came home, settled in Holland, Michigan, where he ran the city's parks and recreation department for years, and lived as a civilian while the paperwork describing his actions sat unprocessed in military files. It was not until the 1970s that a veteran began tracing what had happened. President Jimmy Carter presented Urban with the Medal of Honor on July 19, 1980, 35 years after the last of the actions it described. How many men came home from that war carrying acts of impossible courage that were never written down, never found, never recognized? Urban's case is the one that resurfaced, the one a determined veteran managed to reconstruct from surviving records and witness accounts. It is worth holding on to the possibility that he was not unique, that somewhere in the decades after 1945, other men sat in ordinary jobs in ordinary towns, carrying the weight of things no citation ever named, waiting for a letter that never came. Number 4. Desmond Doss. On the night of May 4th, 1945, a single unarmed medic worked alone on the face of the Maida Escarpment in Okinawa, a 400-foot ridge of shattered rock that American soldiers had named Hacksaw Ridge, lowering wounded men on a rope to safety below, while Japanese forces held the ground above him. He carried no rifle. He carried no pistol. His name was Private First Class Desmond Doss of the 307th Infantry, 77th Infantry Division, and before that night was finished, he had saved 75 lives. Not one of them was his own. Doss was a Seventh-day Adventist from Lynchburg, Virginia, who had reported for induction in 1942, holding 2 beliefs simultaneously: that it was his duty to serve his country, and that his religious convictions absolutely prevented him from taking a human life or carrying a weapon. The United States Army did not know what to do with him. His unit attempted to have him court-martialed for refusing to carry a rifle during training. His commanding officers tried to have him discharged as mentally unfit. Doss declined to leave. He would serve as a combat medic, unarmed, or he would serve no other way. The men who had mocked him, harassed him, and thrown boots at him while he prayed in his bunk at night were the same men who were wounded on Hacksaw Ridge on May 4th, 1945. Doss had already distinguished himself through earlier fighting in the Philippines and at Leyte, but Hacksaw was different. The escarpment was taken, then Japanese counterattacks drove the Americans off. Doss refused to descend. Alone on the ridge, under fire, he moved from wounded man to wounded man, treating them, rigging a rope to the cliff edge, and lowering each one down, reportedly praying between each rescue. "Lord, let me get one more." President Harry Truman presented Doss with the Medal of Honor on October 12, 1945, making him the first conscientious objector ever to receive it. The citation confirmed 75 lives saved on the night of May 4th to 5, a figure revised downward from an initial Army estimate of 100. Doss himself said the number was 50, characteristically unwilling to claim more than he could personally verify. His commanding officer, Captain Vernon, later stated publicly that before Hacksaw Ridge, he had not been a religious man. After it, he was. Desmond Doss was the only man on Hacksaw Ridge who never fired a shot, and he saved more lives than anyone there. His unyielding refusal to carry a weapon was the thing his own army tried to punish him for, and the thing that made what he did possible, because a medic who has made an absolute commitment to preserving life, at any cost, in any circumstance, is operating from a different kind of strength than the men around him. His commanding officer got that right. The rifle was beside the point. Number 3. Audie Murphy. On the morning of January 26, 1945, near the village of Holtzwihr in the Alsace region of France, 2nd Lieutenant Audie Murphy of Company B, 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, watched 6 German panzer tanks and approximately 250 infantry soldiers begin advancing toward his position. His company had been reduced to a handful of men. He ordered them to withdraw into the woods behind him. Then, alone, he climbed onto a burning M10 tank destroyer that had already been hit and set alight, and he got behind its 50 caliber machine gun. He stayed there for 1 hour. Murphy had been born in 1925 in Hunt County, Texas, one of 12 children of a sharecropper, and had lied about his age to enlist after Pearl Harbor. The Marine Corps rejected him for being too small. The paratroopers rejected him for the same reason. The Army infantry took him, and he arrived in North Africa in 1943, still 17 years old, still slight, and proceeded through Sicily, Italy, and southern France, with a relentlessness that his superiors documented in a series of increasingly extraordinary after-action reports. By the time he reached Holtzwihr, he had already been cited for valor multiple times. None of it had come close to what January 26 would require. He fired that 50 caliber for 60 minutes, killing an estimated 50 German soldiers and halting the advance of 6 tanks with the gun's armor-piercing rounds and his own refusal to stop. The tank destroyer beneath him was on fire the entire time. He was using a weapon not designed for infantry suppression to hold off an assault force that outnumbered him by hundreds. When he finally withdrew, it was because he had run out of ammunition, not because the German advance had recovered. He then rejoined his men and led a counterattack that retook the position. The United States Army awarded Murphy 33 military decorations, including the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, and the Silver Star with 2 oak leaf clusters, making him the most decorated American combat soldier of the Second World War. He returned home to write a memoir, To Hell and Back, and to an acting career in Hollywood westerns. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow for the rest of his life. He suffered from what would now be diagnosed as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He advocated publicly for veteran mental health before the medical language to describe what he was experiencing had been fully developed. The Medal of Honor citation for Audie Murphy runs to several hundred words and covers the hour on the burning tank destroyer in clinical military detail. What it does not record is the decades he spent afterwards, unable to sleep without a weapon within reach, revisiting that 60 minutes in the darkness of a country that had given him every medal it had and no tools to process what earning them had cost. The men who turned him away for being too small never received a single decoration between them. Murphy received 33. He paid for every one of them, twice. Number 2, Witold Pilecki. In September 1940, a Polish army cavalry officer named Witold Pilecki stood on a street in Warsaw during a German security roundup, carrying forged identity documents, and allowed himself to be arrested. He had planned this. He had volunteered for it. He was going to Auschwitz, and he was going deliberately because someone needed to go inside and send back reports about what was happening there. And Pilecki had concluded that he was the person who should do it. He arrived at the camp on September 22nd, 1940, and was registered as prisoner number 4859. Pilecki had founded the underground resistance organization Tajna Armia Polska before his voluntary capture, and had already established himself as one of the most tenacious organizers in the Polish resistance. The decision to enter Auschwitz was not impulsive. It was made in full knowledge of what the camp was, based on the fragmentary but alarming reports that had begun reaching the Polish underground. Pilecki believed that if detailed intelligence could be smuggled out to the Polish government in exile in London, and through them to the Western Allies, the evidence would compel intervention. He was wrong about that, but he did not know it yet. Over the next 2 years and 6 months, Pilecki built a resistance network inside Auschwitz, organized prisoner communications, and smuggled at least 3 detailed reports out to the Polish government in exile in London. These were among the first comprehensive Allied intelligence documents describing the systematic murder being carried out at the camp. They named names, described methods, estimated numbers. The reports reached London. British and American authorities received them. The systematic killing of Jewish people at Auschwitz was documented in detail in Allied hands by 1942. The reports did not prompt immediate Allied military action against the camp. Pilecki escaped from Auschwitz on April 27, 1943, and filed a final, comprehensive report. He then fought in the Warsaw Uprising of August to October 1944, was captured by the Germans, and survived a prisoner of war camp until the war's end. He returned to Poland in 1945, still committed to serving his country. The country he returned to was by then under Soviet-backed communist control. The new Polish security service, the UB, arrested him in 1947. He was subjected to a show trial on fabricated charges of espionage and sentenced to death. Polish authorities executed Witold Pilecki on May 25, 1948, the man who voluntarily walked into Auschwitz to document what was happening there, who spent nearly 3 years building resistance under conditions of absolute dauntless terror, who smuggled out the reports that gave the Allies documented proof of the Holocaust, was shot by the government of the country he had given everything to protect. His name was classified by Polish communist authorities for decades. He was rehabilitated posthumously in 1990. There are acts of courage in this list that defy physical explanation, but Pilecki's story asks a harder question than any of them, because it is not really about what one man was capable of. It is about what the world did with it. Number 1. Simo Häyhä. In November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland with a force of 450,000 soldiers. Finland mobilized approximately $300,000 in response. Soviet commanders expected the campaign to conclude in 2 weeks. Finland had no significant armored force, no air superiority, and shared an 800-mile border with an empire that had decided to absorb it. What Soviet planners had not entered into their calculations was the Karelian forest in winter, and one farmer from the village of Rautjärvi who had been hunting in that forest since he was a boy, and understood it in a way that no military intelligence document could have predicted or prepared for. Simo Häyhä was born in 1905 and spent his adult life before the war farming and hunting in the forests of southern Finland. He joined the Finnish Army's 6th Company, 34th Infantry Regiment, when mobilization began, and was deployed as a sniper to the forests near the Soviet border. He was 34 years old. He stood 5 feet 3 inches tall. He used a Mosin Nagant M28 bolt-action rifle with iron sights rather than a telescopic scope, a deliberate choice. A scope required raising his head higher above the snow line, increasing his profile. He wore white camouflage. He packed snow in his mouth to prevent his breath from forming visible clouds in the frozen air. The temperature in those forests dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. He went out anyway, every day, through a winter that was killing men on both sides simply by existing. In approximately 100 days of active combat between November 1939 and March 1940, Häyhä accumulated more than 500 confirmed sniper kills. Finnish military records document the figure. The precise count is debated between 500 and 542, depending on the source. But the lower number alone represents a rate of killing that has never been matched in recorded military history. The Soviet command, unable to locate him through conventional means, deployed dedicated counter-sniper teams specifically tasked with finding and eliminating a single Finnish soldier. When those failed, Soviet artillery was directed to bombard entire sections of forest where he was believed to be operating. The artillery did not find him either. On March 6, 1940, a Soviet soldier hit Häyhä in the jaw with an explosive bullet. The round destroyed the lower left portion of his face. He was carried from the field unconscious and remained so for several days. Finnish medical records document that he regained consciousness on March 13, 1940, the day the Winter War ended, as if his body had been waiting for the outcome before deciding to return. He survived, though his face was permanently reconstructed over years of surgery. He returned to farming. He was asked in later life whether he regretted his kills. He said he had done what he was told to do, as well as he could. He died on November 1st, 2002, aged 96. Every soldier on this list faced odds that should have ended them and found something inside themselves that the odds could not account for. But Simo Häyhä operated in darkness and cold so absolute that survival through a single night required an act of will before the rifle was ever raised. And then he went out and held a forest against an empire, alone, one shot at a time, for 100 days. He never called himself a soldier in any exceptional sense. He called himself a farmer. The rifle, he said in interviews, was simply a tool. The forest was simply home. That is either the most modest thing a man has ever said about the most lethal marksmanship in the history of human warfare, or it is the truest. And the terrifying possibility is that for Simo Häyhä, there was no difference between those two things at all. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.